Okay, so
Yes,
let's just jump into like the deep end of the pool immediately. Rajiv, tell us about Western civilization and eroticism because you were yelling about this on notes earlier today. So let's just get
I
right
feel
into it.
like you got to buy me a drink first before we get
You already
into
have a drink.
that
You're
sort of
already
thing.
drinking. The drink is already done. So go.
Yeah.
Say what
Well,
you're going to say.
well, I was thinking today. The reason this came up, number one, I guess this has been kind of driving around in my subconscious for a while. But just a lot of how there's sort of a lack of very good structured like esoteric and mystical practices in the modern West. And when most people think of things like tantra, they think of like a boomer hippie sex cult, which is, a lot of what happened in the 60s and the 70s.
Yes.
um, or they think it's like some sort of weird Eastern sort of foreign thing, which to be fair, the words like Tantra and Sutra come, from Southeast Asia. Um, but I guess like, so obviously since I grew up in the West, um, like I've been looking more into more based on like random writings and talking to other people. And like, I think like the West tends to have like does actually have a very sort of like pretty strong. It looks like, let's say like magical, mystical, esoteric tradition in a lot of different ways. Um, and so I guess where I was coming from it too is like, so if you like take it from, I'll use like Buddhist vocabulary for now, but if you look at it like using like Buddhist vocabulary, so there's like a difference between what are called sutras, and sutras are like thread. Sutra means literally thread, and so these are like the doctrines or like the teachings that you get from a guru or a particular lineage. And then, like, on the opposite end, or like the complementary end, is what is called Tantra, which is Tantra means to weave. So it's actually taking like the doctrines and the philosophy or the ethics and like weaving them into like a practical life
Mm.
sort of thing, right? So the idea of like tantra is that you don't just like sit in front of the guru and receive teachings forever and like meditation or things like this, but you actually have to weave it. Like you have to re-enter life at some point and try to like weave the things you've learned. And so this is something where basically if you look at why like tantra is associated with sex, is like the whole point of doing this type of weaving is like to learn how to like channel and cope with and direct this sort of like erotic life force. And I think if you look in Western civilization, like I think like the Greeks and the Romans clearly were doing this sort of work, whether it was like through temples or other sorts of rituals or other sorts of things. But like growing up in like 90s Protestant America, where everything is so desacralized and sanitized, like access to that doesn't exist. And so my point of writing that particular note, which is the one that you've talking about, is I noticed after COVID, like COVID was a huge like breaking point and like a reorientation point for a lot of different people. And my experience up to that point of, let's say, like more mystical, esoteric traditions has generally been confined to like the West Coast, like Bay Area scene, where there's a lot of really weird things that go on. Some of them are really unhealthy, some of them aren't. But I've been in contact with a couple of people, and I've known a couple of people, whether it's like in Austin or like Asheville, close to where you are, or other places where it seemed like they were really taking the time to like do their homework in exile and try to like repair the relationship or like the disconnections that have existed in like what would be called a Western tantric tradition. And then I was kind of riffing off of that of like, why had it been broken? Like where are the things that have been left? And I think like one of the things that I've been paying attention to the longest time was like how, Protestants Well, and especially Jews love to like argue about the letter of the law, and like Talmudic debates are notoriously about like reading this sort of scripture and like interpreting the same sentence in like 15 different ways. And you sort of that sort of doctrinal purity is a very like left-brained sort of legalistic like sort of approach to like what would be called the sacred. Um, and it misses a lot of, let's say, the more like again like individuated like right-brained like mystical paths. And so if you look at a lot of the people who practice like tantra, or like again this like type of weaving and integration of like doctrine and ethics into life, into a sense of like aliveness and eroticism, like the people that I've seen have the most success are people who practice like Vajrayana Buddhism, which is focused on magic and rituals. It's
Yes.
not like sitting on the cushion. David Chapman, by the way, on Substack is a really good writer. He writes a blog and a website called Meaningness. Um, you can check it out. But my impression with that was it was always still disconnected from what would be like considered the Western canon of like art and playfulness and theatricality and things like that. And so my original note about like, oh yeah, magic's going to return in 2030, whatever. And then like talking about this is I've seen certain people, like whether it's through their body work practices, whether it's through breath work, whether it's through yoga, whether it's through other things, like they've actually done the homework of like understanding how to connect these threads back together, going back. And a lot of this is just still like impressions that like I don't have concrete facts to back this up. I surmise to like, because World War One was such a catastrophe, like probably a lot of the mystics and like the craftsmen who really have that sort of tantric erotic energy and put it into their building and their architecture and other stuff, they're probably sent off to war and killed, because it just seems like most of the 20th century has lacked any sort of context to some of that stuff. Um, so yeah, I don't know if any of that makes sense.
It does. You know, so listening to you talk, the first thing that came to mind when I saw, also, hello everyone who has joined recently. I am Stephen Bradford Long. I'm with Rajeev Ram and Lirpa Strike. We're talking about weird kinky stuff. Okay. Um weird
No, the
What else is
point the
it?
point is to stop making that association where people hear weird Southeast Asian words and immediately think of
think
random sex cults.
yes, totally. Well, actually, so that's that I think that as I was thinking about it, that's what killed it. Think back to think back to the psychedelic renaissance in the 60s. What killed psychedelic research? What caused that whole tide to withdraw? It was because of this cultural moment that was not adequately cautious, that was not respectful of wider norms. And so you had Ken Kesey, and you had all of these guys just tuning in, dropping out. What's the other word? Tune in, drop out, whatever. And so they had this like, let's just get everyone to do um let's get everyone to drop acid, and then everyone will wake up. The problem is that not everyone should drop acid in a field with 5,000 other people, right? Okay, so I think that there's something similar here where, for whatever reason, in the West, when we talk about eroticism, and by eroticism, as you pointed out, we don't mean kinky stuff, we mean like something deeper and more vital, that has so often been associated with movements that are often incredibly destructive, and it scares people, and it scares society. And the other example that comes to mind is Aleister Crowley and
Mhm.
the esoteric, the Western esoteric movement, or and that was always a counterculture. And so I wonder if part of it is that, but also, yeah, that's my first thought. I'll leave it at that and throw it back at the two of you.
Yeah, I just spent like 10 minutes talking. I don't know if Lirpa, you want to say, I have always more to say. But
Well, you know, Tantra is not something that I'm actually super familiar with yet, although I've started to look into it a little bit more since yoga teacher training last year. Um, but I'm also kind of buried in so many different concepts from that, so slowly working my way through. Uh, but what you said about the like Aleister Crowley and the people who basically the things that scare people. I was also talking to the self-governess Sarah, and she has a lot to say about Bikram yoga, for example. I mean, so that's just, I guess, another example of how a lot of these things end up being somewhat, appropriated by various gurus, and then,
Insane gurus, fucking psychotic, insane gurus.
yeah.
Like, okay, there's a book. There is a book about Bikram called Hellbent, and
Oh,
it is wild. It is like a Hunter S. Thompson esque gonzo journey into the heart of Bikram yoga and just how insanely disgusting and abusive and horrible Bikram. And yeah, I don't know, Rajiv, you probably have thoughts about this.
yeah, so I would say number one, obviously, like growing up in the US, so like having like being broadly divorced from like the cultural context from which a lot of, let's say, these Eastern things originated from. Like, I don't have a direct connection. So, like, there might be people who write books or have teachings or talk about different things. And I think like they automatically assume that it will translate into like, a modern capitalist Western culture of like, oh, just do this meditation practice or do whatever. I have found both through like all the suffering and all the things that I've had to deal with, whether it's my anorexia, or like thyroid issues or whatever else, like it's not like a one-to-one mapping where you can just read like the guru's notes from 600 AD and like
Yeah,
actually apply the things. um, what I would say is what I've discovered so far is, so if you look at like a lot of what we would call like esoteric or meditative or mystical practices, obviously a lot of them, like the initial part of it tends to focus on like cultivating a sense of inner peace, like inner stability, all these other things, maybe stoicism, like I know you've got into that recently. And the idea is basically to like not have so much attachment to like the sensations or the identity you create around or meaning you create around certain events in your life and things like that. And I think the one of the reasons that's important is obviously we live in a world where like so many things are going on and nature is crazy. Uh, and so developing that level of like stoicism or equanimity is important. But what I found is like there's the other side of the equation that doesn't get talked about as much, as which is where I think like actually developing like a good relationship to the erotic or the vitality through something like an intense tantra practice comes in. And the idea is that like from like that foundation or like bedding of equanimity or stoicism or neutrality, like you actually get in touch with the sense of desire and aliveness, and you have to learn how to deploy that creatively in the world through art, through good sex, like not unintegrated immature sex, through craftsmanship, through something I think you enjoy a lot is going a lot in nature and really pushing yourself. And so I think there are like two failure modes that I've noticed. And there's a guy called Daniel Thornton on Substack who actually writes about this. One is like the failure mode of just staying in like this ascetic mindset of like, I'm going to give everything up. I'm just going to be extremely neutral. Like, I'm not going to be reactive to the world. I'm just going to make myself very small. And like, that doesn't actually train you to deal with like the intensity of your own. I mean, if we're going to actually talk about masculinity, like let's say masculine drives of aggression, of like, sex, of other sorts of things. And then the flip side of that is what you're talking about when you have people like in the 60s having everyone drop acid, is you try to do like the development of the intensity and the liveness, but you haven't built that foundation of equanimity first,
you also
right?
you also a lot of this is one thing that I think is often missing in the West. By the way, I know that we're using a lot of terms: tantra, stoicism, et cetera, et cetera. If people have no idea what we're talking about or need clarification definitions, just let us know in the chat. There are no stupid questions. Well, actually, there are in life, but not. Okay, so, um, but the other thing that I think is missing in the way we often, and by we I mean Westerners in a kind of capitalistic mindset. One thing that is missing in the way that we approach these spiritual exercises and practices, meditation, stoicism, etc., is they aren't grounded in ethics. And so often what they're missing, what it's missing when someone sits down to practice yoga or meditation or does the spiritual exercises from Seneca and Epictetus, is there's this whole body of work on how one should treat their neighbor, on how one should live, on what is a right way to live. And without that grounding, you just become a psychopath. Like, because if you're disassociating, or if you are turning down the volume on your reaction to the world, and part of what you're turning the volume down on, oh my god, my cat is yelling, hold on, come here, everyone gets to
It is time.
everyone gets
It was this Eli?
this is Eli,
It's
everyone
always Eli.
Eli.
Hi, Eli. Oh, good. He responded
See, this is an
every
example
time.
of having a good sense of relational ethics, right? You don't ignore the cat whining. You take him onto your lap and pet him and pay him his respects.
Exactly. Okay, so what I was saying is there is interesting research that shows that if people have a predisposition to um antisocial behaviors, practicing meditation will enhance that. It will deepen that. And that doesn't mean do meditation. It just means like this shit is like meditation is just one component out of this vast constellation of really important things that all have to be integrated. It's the tantra, it's that weaving it all together. And he is very emphatically nodding his head.
It's the weaving, it's the integration. Like anybody, anytime somebody talks about a practice, like especially an intense physical slash spiritual practice, and they don't talk about like the weaving, the integrating it back into a relational circle or a sense of relational ethics, it's like, uh, I don't think you're getting the full picture. And that's what I also was trying to get at in my note. Like one of the things I mentioned is like at some point, if you look at, for example, like the beauty of like the Renaissance in the West, right, in terms of the art and like the patronage that was going on. I don't want to speak to like how the modern Catholic Church is, but obviously the Catholic Church was housing some of that because it was getting people to participate in these like sort of sanctifying projects and things like this, right? And so that's exactly part of what I'm talking about is like how does all of these practices that you're doing like integrate back into like a lineage or like a relational or like whatever sort of tribe or system or larger cultural thing that you can take ownership and be a part of, because ultimately if you're developing a relationship to like eroticism or your own erotic potential, it should be deployed in service of something like that, right? Not some sort of self aggrandizing narcissistic project.
Yeah, it shouldn't. I really like what Andrew Perlot. God damn it, Kat. I love you. I love you a lot. You're in the move, 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 move. Okay, sit down. You can sit down.
He
Okay,
wants to be the star.
he does. Um, so okay, um, I really like what Andrew Perlot said last week, where he said the goal of Stoicism is not to make you a more efficient psychopath, but it
It
isn't.
can, yeah.
But it will if you don't integrate it with a broader ethics. But no, I mean, the other thing that came to mind when I read your note was, so for people who don't know, I come from a very unusual religious background where I have just kind of recently stepped out of the non-theistic satanic world. And one of the things that was always true in that world is that they aren't afraid of pleasure. There's a lot of respect for pleasure.
Hmm.
There's a lot of, and so you get like, and I mean people who, like, I had colleagues who would like hang from hooks from the ceiling, like crazy shit, like insane shit. Um, where and that all of that kind of made me the most normal person in the room, right? Like the most basic bitch conservative normie. Like I was the little like Baptist housewife in comparison to all the crazy people I was around. And it's very, and I won't say that that the Satanists always had a healthy relationship with it. That's not what I say. That was always perfectly calibrated, whatever. But they're it's very weird to go to leave that world and kind of enter normie life and realize people are so afraid of pleasure. They're they're so terrified of pleasure. I understand why, because it is intense. But my approach has always been, well, let's become pyromancers. Let's channel that intensity, that pleasure in different ways to achieve mystical experiences, to kind of experience catharsis. Like it's there for a reason, and now I tell I've written about this a bit, but I talk about using, for example, sexuality and intense pleasure as a form of spirituality, and people look at me as if I'm fucking crazy, and so much of it seems to be rooted, and maybe this is uncharitable of me, but so much of it seems to be rooted in what looks like just a fear of pleasure itself.
Do you think that
Yeah,
that
it's
comes
funny.
from like, well, like, I mean, a lot of the people, just going back to TST for a minute, a lot of people in TST I know came from a very maybe sexually repressive sort of Christian background. And I
So,
mean, that's sort of the case in the United States, this puritanical sort of idea towards sex anyway. Do you think that that's probably where the fear of pleasure comes from, that there's something wrong with, or I mean, even if we aren't religious, just that cultural permeation of that idea, that there's
but
something sinful about it, that
but
there's
also, like, when when you read, I am not near as familiar with like the ancient Hindu texts as Rajiv is, obviously. But
Bold of you to assume that I'm familiar with
listen,
that.
listen, I am a basic when it comes to stuff. No, I've seen the stuff you quote.
I will
I've
say right
seen the
now, you can
the
look. My
commentary.
phone is resting against a catalog of Mahabharata and an anthology of the Mahabharata.
Hey,
So
my,
mine is resting against the Symposium by Plato. It's funny.
hey, mine has been resting on the Chronicles of Narnia and on Sita. Uh,
you know
so,
what I was gonna say too, though, is it's funny because you talk about, okay, for example, we had a conversation a long time ago when you had written that thing about porn and like your relationship to porn and like how to cultivate like a healthy relationship to pleasure. And like when you talk about porn in that way, it raises a lot of eyebrows. Maybe because there's a potential for like addictive behavior in that specific activity. But I, for example, if we're talking about like intense tantric practice, like becoming alive, with your eroticism, I go to the MMA dojo and I wrestle for like two or 2.5 hours and get the shit beat out of me, right? And that's like also in a weird way like a pleasurable experience because it is using your body
Yeah.
in these very intense, extreme ways to get a sort of relation to develop a sort of relationship on like how and where you should deploy this sense of power and energy in meaningful ways. But that tends to get a lot of less strange looks, right? Than being like, I draw weird pictures online, or I experiment with weird types of porn or whatever else.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and that, by the way, I mean, that sort of thing too, if you look at most like martial traditions, it's the same thing where like you develop a sense of like peacefulness or equanimity, and then you go into the arena and practice that as a way of like developing your own skill and also like developing relationships with others, right? Like that's one of the big points of going to a place like the dojo.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I look at Western, in particular Western spirituality, what I just don't see that. I do see it in some places, like in the mystical traditions, um, especially the Catholic mystics. They said some interesting things about this. John Donne, his poem "Batter My Heart, Three-Personed God," is very much like an eroticization of his relationship with God, where he says, "Batter my heart, three-personed God, burn, blow, and break, and make me new." And then he says, "I'll never be free lest you ravage me." And that's a very that was a very like sexual, erotic term. And so there are examples of Western Christianity bringing that erotic energy and using it as a catalyst for deepening their spirituality, right? But most of the time, I don't see that. Most of the time, if you read Saint, and if you read a lot of the kind of most foundational stuff, I just see a repression. And maybe I'm completely wrong about this, and I'm sure there are many Christians who will disagree with me on this, but I don't see that kind of active participation with one's natural energies the way I see it in parts of Hinduism and Buddhism, for example.
Mhm.
Um, yeah. Did you have a thought, Lirpa?
I just wanted to read Ishmael's comment. He says, violence can also be a form of intimacy, another uncomfortable fact. And yeah, I
Cool.
mean, as Rajeev had talked about, getting the shit beat out of him. I mean, in a non-sexual way, right? But it still feels really good, and I think that touches on that a little bit. Um, where that comes from, varies, I think, by person. But
Yeah,
yeah, I
totally.
So, I mean, if we're gonna relate this to, because I thought we were supposed to talk about like men and
Oh yeah,
masculinity, and so
me
far
too.
we've
But
avoided that. I mean, the other part of the no, it's good. The other part of that note is, I think one of the reasons I was talking about this is because I specifically think, and I don't have a good map of this, so don't come at me, bro. All the people in the comments, but certainly the way people like the cultivation of whether you want to call it eroticism or aliveness or vitality, I think it differs pretty significantly between men and women. And one of the comments that I was making is because in the West, World War One and then obviously World War Two were such disastrous events, and it killed off a lot of really virtuous, brave like men who probably had both let's say connection to like actual like mystical lineages, but also just people who had learned within their own cultures to develop that sort of vitality in sort of a rich culture, because there was so much death and blood. Like I think in the West too, specifically as it relates to developing that relationship to pleasure, right? Whether it's like, you know, you are in the Marines and you do like really difficult, strenuous physical stuff, or you're in something like TSC and you like develop a very nuanced relationship to your own sexuality, or you're in like, a famous band and like you're touring and developing a lot of music and creative potential, like a lot of those containers for sort of allowing men to develop both like a sense of um like natural like vitality as it relates to their erotic potentials, and also a good sense of like inner authority when it comes to stopping what might be harmful or leading others into a good relationship. They haven't, I think that's a big struggle. And that's also something you write about. It's like, just look at the state of masculinity today, and not a lot of us have room for that sort of,
Yeah,
broadly speaking, like tantric integration.
yeah. It's speaking of masculinity. I am doing this thing. It is some kind of I I'm not allowed to know what it is, but it's some kind of ritual initiation for men in the forests for multiple days, and no one is allowed to tell me what it is. So I'm like, sure, I'll do this thing. If I get ritual scarification, that's fine. We'll go with it. Like, okay, Ishmael says I was referring to consensual combat earlier, nothing creepy. I realize now how that might have come across. Not at all. We
Oh, I
totally,
didn't think it was creepy. I
no,
mean,
Yeah,
totally
I thought
get
it
it.
was true.
there's a
It's
there's a lot
true.
of you know there's a
Yeah.
lot of talk about that sort of thing, especially right now. I mean, just BDSM or literally any of that, like domination, it's all over. I'm not seeing it as creepy. I just thought it was an interesting point to make, even if that's not what you meant. But
Someone in a comment recently used the phrase "the charmed circle of acceptable sexuality," and I really the and that came from that phrase, "the charmed circle," came from some feminist writer who was critiquing the second wave feminists and the Pope, according to this commenter. I haven't looked into this, so this is very much just trust me, bro situation. But I really like that phrase, the charmed circle. And the charmed circle is like that which is socially acceptable forms of intimacy. And violence is not one, violence is not in that. Like combat,
no,
the kind of intimacy and bonding that comes from combat, consensual combat, that's not in the charmed circle. Kink is not in the charmed circle. At least where I am. People hear me say this stuff and they're like, "What are you talking about? This stuff is so socially acceptable." I mean, in the cultural milieu that I was raised in and that I feel like I'm surrounded by here in the American South. Right. If you go to LA, it's a different story.
yeah,
But
or
um
just South Minneapolis.
is South Minneapolis like that?
I mean, it's got a very, I'm just kind of making fun of it, but it's got a very alternative sort of vibe in a very specific kind of part of the city. Yeah.
Nice.
The funny thing that I thought of when you said do you say charmed circle? Is that,
The
or
charmed circle,
the
yeah.
charm circle? The funny thing that came to my mind is what isn't acceptable intimacy is men who are friends sending long letters to each other, like
Yeah.
Abraham Lincoln used to do to
Oh,
all of his friends.
I was just
I don't know why that came to my
okay.
mind, but I think it was, I don't know, maybe like a while ago or something like that. Like, whoever, like the social justice activists or weird sort of like civil rights accounts were like trying to retrospectively say that Abraham Lincoln was gay because he used to write all these letters. And I was like, that just seems like a natural, like, why would you necessarily automatically conclude that just because he's writing like pages of long, intimate letters to his friends? Like, that sounds really fun. That's not in the charm circle, apparently, of intimacy.
No, it isn't. And the thing is, maybe he was gay, but it's not because of that.
You're right.
Yeah.
Right.
So
Well, yeah, that's like in the symposium. I mean, I just got past the introduction, but the introduction is really interesting because it was written in the 50s in this particular edition that I'm reading. And
what
the, sorry,
what are you reading?
oh, the Symposium by Plato.
Oh, got it.
Um, I just started it and I just got past the introduction. But in the introduction, the author, it was written in the 50s, he kind of gives this long sort of preamble about how they're talking about homosexual love in particular, because the whole dialogue is about love and sexuality. And yeah, so it's interesting. I mean, it actually, if you put yourself in the mindset of what you might imagine the 1950s, it actually maybe sounded just a little bit more accepting. But, comparing it to, 2025, it was very interesting to
Mm.
see him kind of apologize for it. Like some of this might offend, readers in this day and age to know that they were discussing homosexuality and how, reproduction or how sex with the opposite sex was basically just seen as reproductive only in Greek society at that time.
You know what?
And
Yeah, go on, go on.
oh no, please.
So the article that I am slowly cobbling together, it'll either come out this coming week or next week. Speaking of the charmed circle of forms of intimacy that fall outside the charmed circle, I'm writing an article about covenantal relationships that are not marriages
Mm.
and how we've lost them. My brilliant young friend David, he just goes by David on Substack. Um, he's a good guy, and but he did a talk about how in the Byzantine Empire there were three. I'll probably mess this up, and David can correct me later. But there were three forms of legally recognized covenants, and the first was obviously marriage. But then the second one was godparent. It was a mentor relationship where an elder would take on the spiritual responsibility of mentoring a young person for their life. But then the third was called Adelpha Poesis, or brother, and it was it was a kinship bond. And so you look through ancient literature and you look through great poetry, and you just see an approach to friendship and a covenantal understanding of friendship that we just don't have today. So in the Bible, Ruth and Naomi, Ruth telling Naomi, "Where you go, I will go. Where you die, I will die. Your people shall be my people. Your God will be my God. And where you die, I will be buried." And she says this vow. And then there's David and Jonathan, where it says Jonathan loved David, or David loved Jonathan with as his own soul, and they do this exchange where they do ritual where they take off their armor and they give it to each other, as and then the vow extends beyond death, and David cares for Jonathan's children for his death. So it's and then there's Roland and Oliver in the Song of Roland, and then in Christian mysticism there is kind of a cross-sex friendship between Saint John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila, and they had a holy friendship. And so when you look through ancient literature and history, what you find is just a much deeper understanding of friendship and kinship and bonding that is covenantal, that today is completely consolidated into the one relationship of marriage. I think that that's a
And
tragedy.
even
I
then,
think that
not
that's
necessarily all the time.
oh yeah,
Um,
and not necessarily. I just got a notification that my internet connection is unstable. So if I start if my video fucks up, just let me know. Um, Ishmael says, I think we need a shitload of non creepy, weird uncles. Young men have no brotherhood and no mentorship. Correct. And then Claire wrote, I write long, intimate letters to my wife, quotations, just a friend, but we bicker like a married couple. Yes. And then Prester John Andrews says the fetishization of male friendship is an underrated form of homophobia. I assume by that you mean the sexualization of male friendship. But clarify if that's what you meant, Prester. Uh,
Make platonic. Make the new. Let's us three start a new political platform to make writing long, intimate, passionate letters to our platonic friends great again.
yes,
Yes,
absolutely.
let's do
Well,
it.
I was just a friend of mine earlier today was like, yeah, I'm writing a long letter by hand to one of my really good friends, and I was like, oh, that's so sweet. We need more of that.
Yeah.
Um, but all that to say, I think that there is a sort of friendship and covenantal friendship that just we don't get, we don't understand, we don't. It is culturally outside of the charmed circle, and I think that we are really impoverished by that. And I've been thinking a lot about ritual in general, like, because it feels like we have a very narrow range of rituals. We have marriage, we have funerals, we have college graduation, we have high school graduations.
Are you talking purely secular?
Yeah, just like culture, like
Yeah.
what are the ritual? But we don't have initiations.
Right.
We don't have friendship rituals. We don't have all of these other communal things. It feels really impoverished.
I would say too, one thing maybe that's at the intersection of what we're talking about, which is like, healthy vitality and masculinity is
This is Lilith, by the way. Everyone say hello.
Hi, Lilith.
very cute.
Yes. He's like, get the cat the fuck out of my face. Let me finish my.
I think you should do like a photo shoot of all your cats and like have them be in various poses. That'll actually probably be too much difficulty for you to get them all in the same thing where they're actually together that you
I
can take a picture.
tried. I've tried doing that. The only time that I've ever been able to do that is during the daily feeding frenzy. That's the only time that they're ever.
Say say no more words. I think I know everyone can picture exactly what goes on
Yeah.
during that. That must be a ritual in and of itself.
It is a ritual in itself.
Um, so I was gonna say, grief is another ritual that doesn't exist, especially for like
Mm.
men grieving all sorts of things in their life. And I think there's a lot of cultural examples where grief is treated much more as a social thing, because grief, because it's letting go of someone like in their death, that actually itself contains a lot of vitality, right? It's like honoring somebody's life, like kind of understanding how to let go of your like physical, like living relationship to them, and knowing how to conduct grief well. And like that's something that doesn't exist. And I imagine in the past like there was a lot better like structures, especially if we're talking about those covenantal relationships, that would help deal with grief as a sort
Well,
of ritual.
okay, another thing that we've consolidated all of this stuff to is therapy.
Mhm.
Yeah.
If you think about the right of confession, the therapist is bound by law to not the DM. And so you can tell the therapist anything unless it's illegal, or unless you're abusing someone or whatever the case may be. But the yeah, like we've consolidated such a wide range of human experiences into like these two zones: therapy, to kind of take the place of a wise friend, of the grief ritual. My cat is yelling at me now. Ow, 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 ow. Okay. Um, it takes place of like the wise friend or just a kind friend, and so often when people go to Ishmael says, "Damn it!" So Catholics have just been getting through therapy the whole time. I mean, I would not describe confession as therapeutic. I would, confession can be fucking brutal.
I've never been.
I never went either, but I have friends who were raised Catholic and they're just like they told horror stories about confession. But yeah, so anyway,
I
um,
imagine a sort of confessional practice, whether it's through therapy, should actually be a little bit brutal in sort of that it's like a lifting weights session
yes,
where it's challenging and you try to like build yourself up better. And like we haven't I like either confession is wildly brutalizing without any gains, or we have therapy that's like oftentimes intensely validating without any
Yeah.
pressure, right? And there's no actual like, oh, you will be brutalized a little bit in healthy ways that will actually help you get better as a person that you can heal from,
Mhm.
type of thing.
Yeah,
uh,
that's the thing about therapy that I was gonna mention too, is that since it's kind of taken on the role of confession in a sense, you expect it to kind of serve that role, like, you know, you have to do some work, and that's not to, I'm not there's a lot of good therapists, but I think it's widely complained about right now that a lot of therapy is a bit too validating. A lot of people's experiences in therapy are, and they're not very challenging. A lot of therapists are more likely to, you know, affirm your decisions and just try to make you feel better about them and less guilty, or, you know, anything like that. Which I don't think is it's probably very helpful for certain reasons that people go to therapy, when it's maybe shame related unnecessarily, but I think perhaps they might take that approach a little too broadly, you know, with other people, and not being terribly helpful in the process.
I I first have to read some chats here. Leaving art school says you can just video yourself, confess to your camera, watch it. There you go. Um, and then the Horn Gate. We love you, Horn Gate. By the way, if people don't read both the Horn Gate and Leaving Art School, you should do both. Subscribe to both of them. Horngate says, "Well, it's Monday morning, so and here we are again. Love this weekly chat. I'm so glad."
Me too.
Okay, I was about to say I can't remember what it was. What was I was just distracted by the chat.
We were talking about you know, doing the hard work that comes from, say, like, you don't get the
Oh,
gains from the.
oh, that's right. Have either of you read very controversial book by a very controversial author called Bad Therapy by Abigail Schreier?
Ooh, not yet, but it's in my Kindle library.
I read it. I liked it. I mean, I listened to it, and whenever I listen to an audiobook, I especially if it's nonfiction, I just don't critically engage with it as much.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, it's
I
harder when you.
with fiction, I can listen to it and just be totally immersed. Nonfiction, for whatever reason, when I listen to it, it's just more of like a. So I didn't really critically engage with it, but her argument, which I thought was really interesting, which is therapy is a it's a treatment. Um it is a medical intervention. And every medical intervention will have, and you don't take on those risks unless the medical intervention is necessary. And her premise is we are taking on the risks of therapy when it isn't always necessarily medically necessary.
Hmm.
It's
So
like taking an antibiotic for fun,
yeah, like
right?
taking fun, it's like going to the hospital and exposing yourself to the flesh bacteria that could live there, and suddenly you have MRSA, or getting surgery for no reason is an extreme example when it's better not, and so it's like there's no intervention is a 100% positive. And but what we've
Mhm.
seen, what it look the way we approach therapy culturally is, oh, this is just an unalloyed good in every case, and it's not actually. I've had therapy really fuck me up sometimes, and
I love this comment from Claire. I had to go to confession every year growing up, and he just said the same thing every time. There was no trust or context built uh, there. And my favorite part of the therapy was always the rare time they corrected me instead of validating. I enjoy
Same.
being put in my place. I'll actually draw this all the way back to what we were talking about at the beginning, which is like, okay, so if you engage, let's say, in like a very intense like tantric practice, ideally it's situated both within like a particular lineage, meaning like a set of like gurus or teachers that have passed down the knowledge over time, and it's also in a sangha, like a community, so like a church. We're also doing it with like other disciples and practitioners, and the point is that you're not just sitting every day, like meditating or doing some sort of weird ritual. Like, let's say you meditate for 40 days, but then, like, you still get really angry and start abusing other people. Like, your teacher will be like, go do the dishes and chop wood and carry water. And so that's like a context in which, like, someone is observing you do your practice, and how you're developing, and then giving you personalized instructions on what's working, what's not, what you need to change. And so it's a supportive context, but like the guru won't be like afraid to like slap you on the butt with the paddle if you like are still being an asshole to all of the other disciples around you, right? And so when we're talking about like a context like confession or therapy, especially isolated therapy, what's the point of like going to therapy if you're not situated in some sort of a relational context where you're actually being held accountable, or you're actually testing whether what you're learning is making certain aspects of your life better or more smooth, right?
yeah, totally. I mean, I'm in. I have a great therapist. He is very skillful at what he does, but I'm someone who needs a therapist. Like I'm someone for whom it is the right medical choice to have a therapist. And part of part of the process of being in therapy is like developing interconnection with the community, and then he just kind of like aids in that process. Claire says, I'm reading Bad Therapy right now and might write about it. She has interesting insights, but not the data to back it up, and overlooks some big things, in my opinion. Totally agree with her axiom that anything powerful enough to heal also has the power to harm, though. I would absolutely love to read that piece. Please write it, because I've been, like I said, I wasn't really able to critically engage with it. Um,
Speaking of things that are awesome but have the potential to harm, I'm gonna get a little bit more vodka and I'll be right back.
you great. Um, so yeah, no, I'm on. I have a great therapist right now who keeps me sane. Well, he doesn't keep me sane. He helps me keep myself sane. And
Yeah.
one of the ways is to just like track. He helps me track my mood.
Mhm.
Uh,
That is one really beneficial thing that I've found. I do have some issues with my therapist not he's probably a little too validating, and I've told him this. He seems to be getting a little better, but one thing that I appreciate about him is that he does remind me of things that I've forgotten, like the whole timeline, the, I don't know, year and a half or a little longer that I've been seeing him. He'll say, "Hey, do you remember when you told me this?" And how you've actually made some progress since then. And these are things that I wouldn't have noticed before. So it kind of sets into my mind anyway, like how, okay, I'm not really seeing the big picture here. I'm just, now it broadens the scope for me a little bit. Zooms out, lets me see, you know, exactly what's been done or not been done, for that matter, progress or lack thereof.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean it, and I've had. I talked about this in a previous live stream, but I had one therapist who she would just have me talk and talk and talk and talk and talk and talk and talk, and I felt like I was spinning my wheels and spinning my wheels and spinning
Yeah.
my, and it actually just fucked me up so much. I was like, I need to do more than talk. I I am a gay substacker. I do not help talking about my I I already talk about my emotions to thousands of strangers on the internet.
Yeah.
I need help with like practical base coping shit. And her strategy was to just like sit down and just I would talk and talk and she would like urge it on. She would and she took a very like just kind of it was kind of classic psychotherapy. Prester says, "I am a gay substacker." Quote of the year. Well, thank you. But yeah, I'm a gay man. I do not
I
need
mean, I
help
think
with
I
my
think like even it's funny because like there are times where it's like a good D&D game for like a couple hours is way better than therapy.
yes,
And I think the problem of let's say like any sort of practice that's trying to get you to engage in some way like to correct or to like help you develop a better relationship to your own um energies, vitality, circumstances, behaviors. So some part of it obviously has to be like intellectual and maybe dialectical, but I think part of it has to be creative so that you can apply things and express yourself. Part of it probably has to be like because we're in bodies, it has to be like physical
yes,
and like related to your own
Mhm.
physical body. And so anything that like over indexes on like let's say the intellectual dialectic at the expense of like the physical or the artistic or creative or expressive, um, or like in community, like that's just not going to, it's going to max out one stat and make you lopsided, and that causes more delusions, I think, than
yeah.
it fixes.
I, but also, just here's the thing, and this is the thing that depression is like a boil of self. It is like a ballooning of self, and it is your story. It is about my story and my thought, and it's all me and me all the way down, and so it's like this inflation, and sometimes what I need to do is is lance the boil of self and and just do something else, anything else, like shovel cat shit. I have 6 cats, a lot of cat shit. Go for a long run or just hang out with a friend and talk about stuff like it. And so sometimes the like spinning my wheels and thinking about, sometimes that's important sometimes, but often it's just thinking about the story more. It's just thinking about the self more, when like what I need is like escape from that. I need to get out of that.
I
uh
think I've written about how oftentimes I find like driving for long stretches of time. This is why I like road tripping. I don't know if either of you like road tripping,
I love it.
but for
I'm
me,
here because of road trip.
that's often a much more meditative and erotic exercise than like sitting on a cushion or doing anything else, specifically trying to pursue pleasure. Because when I'm in the car, like obviously I'm in the driver's seat, but it's like what you're talking about, Stephen. You like disidentify with yourself because you're
yeah,
in this machine going on. So like you're paying your attention and awareness is attuned to all the different like bumps that are happening in the different parts of the car, the trees that are blurring past your window, the things that are on the road in front of you. And so, like, my sense of awareness and attention goes a lot out of myself and it goes into all the other things. And it's very gratifying. And
yeah,
that's like to me a meditative, like intense tantric practice, right? Because it is intense, right? If I go for like a 7-hour road trip, like I'm spent by the end of the day, right? Because all of my chemicals in my body are oriented towards like driving this 2,000-pound machine down the road and paying. But it's like a really nice exercise, and it really helps me get in touch with my sense of power, my sense of mechanics, and sort of kinesthetic abilities. And so it's like sometimes the prescription is go on a fucking road trip.
Yeah.
That's the thing that helps.
I mean,
Yeah, go on, Lirpa. Yeah.
well, I definitely relate to this because I went on a fairly spontaneous road trip, just a few weeks ago from Virginia, where I live, to Minnesota. And it was very, very spur of the moment. When I decided to leave, I only planned it for like a week. And this is something I did last spring as well. After I finished yoga teacher training, I wanted to drive back to Minnesota to visit my family and teach some yoga classes here. But the reason I wanted to drive was just for the freedom, to be like, when I fly, I have to borrow cars. It's annoying. But, that was my initial motivation for driving. But what I realized on my way back, I took a southern route that got me through. I had to like weave around these mountain roads in West Virginia, and beautiful, terrifying, but beautiful. And the whole time, my last night, I stopped when it was dark, and I ended up staying at like the first little inn or whatever I could find in this cute little mountain town. And I remember that night, I thought, man, I'll be home in 2.5 hours tomorrow, and I don't want to be yet. I was enjoying that drive so much, just that time to myself to completely just, obviously there's like you're talking about, you need all of your senses, especially on those crazy roads, which I don't think I went up to the speed limit the whole time. Like I'm sure everyone behind me was so angry because I was terrified, but I took a different route this time. I took the turnpike. but that last time, I mean, there was still something so magical about it, despite how annoying, I might have been to all of the other drivers, but I didn't want it to end, and I went home thinking, where can I drive next? And that's when I quickly made the commitment to go to that Appalachian Trail trail maintenance thing up in Pennsylvania, and then I went on another couple-hour trip to a concert. Like all I wanted to do at that point was drive because it felt so healing, and driving was something that I typically hate. I live in the DC metro, so driving is the worst torture on the planet every single day. And in this case, it wasn't, I wanted to touch on one other thing besides the road trip, though, that you had mentioned before, which is the physicality. And I'm sorry to keep yapping, but I can't remember who talked about it, but it might have been on this live stream that we had this conversation. But something about men in particular, talk therapy for a lot of men just simply does not work. You need something physical. And even when you talk about men getting together to talk, you can't just kind of sit in a circle necessarily and have that be effective to speak. But they found that a lot of times if you get a group of men together to do something like woodworking or, chopping wood, whatever it is that, some physical activity, that these conversations, the more like intimate sort of feelings-based conversations that we keep imploring men to have or saying that they don't have, they tend to just happen organically in those situations when there's already something physical happening.
Absolutely.
I'll give you a very concrete example of that, Lirpa, which is 2 Saturdays ago. This is before I fell very sick, right before, in fact. I might have got sick there. I'm just recovering from a terrible sickness, but we were doing wrestling for 2.5 hours, and then afterwards, and we were all exhausted. Usually we just sit on the mat afterwards, and we chat about other things. Usually, like some of the guys, they talk about like MMA, like actual like pro fighting and stuff like that, which I'm not super into. But then we started talking about like sports that we did in high school and like weightlifting and all of that. And I think like a common experience is like most guys when they get like 16, 17, like they start getting into weightlifting because like it gives you a sense of agency and like it's the one thing where you can feel like you're in control and you also like get to become really strong. And this guy like talked about like how he felt like he had body dysmorphia when he was 16, like he felt like a weakling, right? And that's like a type of body dysmorphia where you feel like you need to get really strong. I've never done studies on it, but I presume actually, in fact, a lot of male bodybuilders probably do have body dysmorphia in some sense. They feel like they're too scrawny or weak or small.
Yes.
And so, we talked about that for a little bit. We didn't really do it in like a therapy speak, but it was in the context of like, oh, we used to do weightlifting a lot, but now I just do more functional strength and that sort of thing. Because I found that like, even if weightlifting like makes you shredded, it doesn't necessarily feel as good and it impacts your mobility and that type of thing. That's a classic example. But I would add to what you're saying too, is that like the two things that I feel like the reason why like the physicality helps a lot too is, especially for men, like number one, it helps you like test your limits, which I think is a really important thing for men. Like they just have a drive to like test their physical limits in a lot of ways. And then also if you do a group activity, whether that's like woodworking or like martial arts or something else, like it involves a certain amount of like strategy of like positioning yourself, figuring out either where you can be helpful or where you can win. And that sort of thing I think is very like satisfying. I think it's one of the reasons why like men like playing video games so much too, right? Which is the non-physical way of either trying to like test your limits or like strategize in a way that feels really,
Yeah.
but like doing something
And
physical.
D&D too has
Yeah,
that
but
strategy part.
doing something physical often like brings those two things, testing the limits and strategizing, in a very embodied way that feels intimate, which I think Ishmael was said violence can be intimate.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
There's a question that Ishmael had, by the way, that lots of great thoughts and comments in the chat. I won't be able to get to all of them, but really good thoughts. But Ishmael has a question that I thought was good. Do you guys have any advice for people as far as therapist compatibility, red flags, etc.? What are your thoughts?
Well, for me, I've only had 3, and the first 2 were very short-lived, so I honestly don't
Yeah.
think I'm experienced enough
My
to give a good answer to that.
my thing is just fine. And this is 100% my own bias. This is one, so totally take this with a grain of salt. This is just me. I when I go to a therapist, I'm not there to talk. I'm there to have a physical for a to see a physical therapist for my mind. Tell me the exercises that I need to do. I will do them, and then I'll come back next week. Like that's what I want. That's what I need is like, and my I told this to my current therapist, and he was like, "Great, got it." And so he gave me like very practical stuff to do, and so I'm partial to CBT, all of the BTs
Mhm.
and BTs, like cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy. A lot of the lineages that come out of CBT, just because they're so practical, it's so fucking basic. It isn't spiritual, it isn't enlightenment, it isn't like profound. It's just like, okay, you have it's like the physical equivalent of your hip is really hurting you. Okay, do these exercises, it will stop hurting in a week. That and
So I don't know if you feel this way too, but Stephen, for me, when I seek out a therapist, usually it's either like I have a very specific like, for me, like I want it to be time limited, like, and that doesn't mean like I go into it thinking it's time limited, whether it's 4 months or a year. It's like this is not a perpetual thing
oh yes,
that's going to be forever. And
totally.
also, I have an idea of a problem that I want to address, and basically the therapist is there to help. So oftentimes, like for me, like I experience a lot of shame just in my life. Like I just feel a lot of shame in general, and so, like in general, I've become pretty good at dealing with that. But sometimes, like there's aspects of shame that can't seem to deal with. So it's like I'll be working at a job, and it's like I feel so ashamed, like showing up to work and my quality of work. And so the point of the therapist is like if you're my therapist, Stephen, I'll be like, all right, Stephen, like here's this problem of shame that's showing up in this context. I'm trying to like build an architecture of what it looks like so I understand like what's going in, what's going out, And then your job is to help me because I'm the one stuck in it. Like, I probably can't see all the options. You're going to help me fill in the details to build a better architecture of it. And that way things will become more clear. And then, like, after 3 months, like, we'll have solved the problems. And then it's on me to, like, implement the strategies that you give me, because that is the only way that, number one, I feel like is therapy is effective, and also that I have agency over my life. Like, you, like, if I give my agency to you over as the therapist, then I'm fucked.
Yes, exactly. No, I mean, it reminds me. It reminds me of my. So I was a vocal performance major. I'm class. My previous life is that I was a classical vocalist, and my absolutely brilliant voice teacher named Timothy Wilds. He said on the first lesson that we ever had together, he said, "My job is to make sure you no longer need me."
See,
And
that's yeah. It's
yeah,
good.
that my job is to make sure that you don't need me. And
Correct.
that I think is the approach of. Now there are some conditions. Eshmiel says tenor. No, I'm a baritone. Um, there are some conditions that kind of require ongoing maintenance and ongoing mood disorders. And if someone is schizophrenic or has a mood disorder or a personality disorder, sometimes ongoing maintenance is important for that. But I think most, I don't know. My bias is know what the problem. It's like when you go to grad school. You don't go to grad school out of this general sense of opportunity. No, that's a fuck ton of debt. Instead, you go to grad school because you're like, I have this specific thing that I need to do or I want to do or I have an opportunity to do. And in order to do that specific thing, I will go to grad school. Otherwise, you're just exposing yourself to a lot of needless stuff. And I kind of see therapy in the same way, where it's like, unless you have a specific need that needs to be addressed, then maybe the solution is not a therapist. Maybe a solution is a religious community.
I mean,
People who do.
therapy is a professional context, right? If you can't solve your problem, the professional context, just like grad school, can help you develop ideas or help you explore something. But the professional context of therapy and or grad school might not be the correct thing, right?
Yep.
So you don't get a graduate advisor if, like, you're trying to figure out, like, I don't know, how to cook a better corn on the cob. Like, that's
Yeah,
not a sort of thing
exactly.
that happens.
And by the way, none of this is to trash therapists. It's like a vital. Like, I'm a person who needs therapy. Like, I need to be in therapy, and therapy saves so many lives. Just I think we sometimes over invest. And I think that so many therapists would say the same thing. We
By the way, I love, this is unrelated, but I love how leaving art school said I have writer's dysmorphia in reference to our discussion about body dysmorphia. Classic.
You know,
Classic.
I'm interested in this idea that, you know, therapy is a specific way to help a specific problem, and that it shouldn't necessarily be an ongoing thing. And I wonder how much of that, we're talking about masculinity, but I think that this might point to how masculinity is contrasted with like maybe a more feminine approach. Because for someone like me, I actually went into it thinking I did have specific issues that I wanted to address, but also I thought, for me, and also for a lot of other women I know, when I think about it, therapy is less about like people. We just want someone to talk to, a neutral third party, to
Mm.
give us feedback that we can't necessarily get from a group of friends because they're not neutral and they're not objective.
That's
And maybe for women, this is something, and for a lot of men too, but for women, I think a lot of us might feel like we need that we don't have that, because in a lot of our friendships, especially the intrasexual ones, just with women, you know, there might not be a lot of honesty. There's a lot of like validation where you might not need it. There's a lot of, you know, a lot of it. I'm not trying to overly generalize, but it's something that I've experienced and that a lot of my friends have as well. But people will tell you look good when you don't, things like that. Maybe the guy's interested in you when it's clear that he isn't. There's that movie and book about, he's just not that into you, which kind of goes over this whole thing that women do with each other, which is just the completely ineffective validation for the sake of it because you don't want to hurt their feelings. So for a lot of women, it might actually make a lot of sense to have more of that kind of outlet, that can help you. Although it can end up being way too circular sometimes, in the sense where like Stephen, you were talking about, you could just ramble and go on and on and on. And if you don't have, if they're not reining you in somehow, pointing you, trying to get you to focus where you need to focus, it could just end up being more harmful than anything else. And, I found the same thing sometimes with writing. If I get really into a really long post that's super emotionally in depth about something and I'm ruminating for like, I remember I did this with one I wrote almost a year ago about this guy from North Carolina when I was in high school, like this, very brief little romance, this teenage romance. And it took me down such an emotional path. And it was so long ago, but I was reading through all these diaries and journals from that time period, looking at pictures and just, I don't know how healthy that was for me to spend a few weeks, just sitting there thinking about all of that, overly analyzing it, just all in my own head. And then going, and I would talk to my therapist about it too. I'm like, listen, man, I've been writing all this stuff and it's bringing up all these things. And, yeah, I wonder, it's hard to find that balance of
So
letting yourself, yeah.
I think the answer, to me, the only answer is just mindfulness. Is like developing enough of a relationship with myself to know when I feel bad, like
Mhm.
when the thing isn't. But the problem is that that is such a delicate, hard skill, right?
yeah, I
Mhm.
mean, actually, so Claire was saying every therapist or coach I've ever had said I'm too results oriented. Like, fair enough, but am I also not here to get results, bro? So I think this actually combined with Steven's comment is like, this is actually how I feel about most like meditative or tantric practices is like, basically there's a way that I try to determine whether this sort of practice after a certain amount of commitment is actually doing something. And generally the thing that I gauge it against is like, is this making me more like sort of like loving and playful and energetic towards the activities and beings around me? And obviously there are like exceptions. And if you're like in a really abusive like work situation or relationship situation, like it doesn't help to like, meditate or do some sort of practice that makes you more loving and joyful and energetic towards that. But I think when you're talking about mindfulness, I have a pretty good idea of when I'm like running on fuel that's sort of clean and clear. So things that are like energy, love, playfulness versus what I would call like bad fuel, which is things like anxiety, like I need to prove myself. And the goal is not to eliminate like every sort of like any sort of like sense of vitality or energy that powers whatever relationship activity is always going to have some sort of combination of like clean fuel and like maybe more bad or dirty fuel. But the idea is that if I'm engaging in a practice, whether it's MMA or meditation or like mantra chanting or therapy or whatever else, is that through a certain amount of commitment and time length like changing the fuel to be more clean fuel that allows me to be more playful and energetic and loving towards the things and beings and activities around me. And I don't have a good way of measuring that, but you can often see it in people like I had a conversation with my health coach 2 weeks ago, and she was like, "This is the best I've ever seen you. Like, you seem really energetic, you seem calm, you seem like you're not scattered all over the place." And like that is good feedback to know like the current gambit of various practices that I'm doing is working well.
Yeah, totally. Um, God damn it! I just had a thought and I totally forgot.
I love that poster, Nosferatu.
Oh yeah, that's that's the Werner Herzog version of Nosferatu.
Oh,
If
it's too bad Cinema Tim Shell isn't here. He was just talking about that the other day. But
about
yeah.
about
Uh, about the Werner Herzog version
Yeah, I mean,
of
it's
that one.
the Werner Herzog version is gorgeous. And yeah, I mean, it just has like the best soundtrack, beautiful shots. It's wonderful, and everyone should go see the new Robert Eggers. It's not in theaters anymore, but everyone should see the new Robert Eggers Nosferatu. I thought it was brilliant. It was artsy fartsy bullshit, but I thought it was great. Um, so what all did we write this week? Did we write like I wrote a piece, but Ra- Rajiv and Lirpa, what are your most recent pieces that you've written?
That
Mine
I
is still the
published.
collage one because I am still on my vacation or whatever for the next week, so I haven't really done much writing. But I next I'm starting one about I wrote the one about un, uh, sorry, unconditional love that we talked about with Carrie a couple weeks ago.
Yeah,
Uh, there's a sequel to that one that's just going to be kind of funny. That same guy that I was talking about, the stories about how I almost broke up their band once.
yeah.
So, yeah, I'm really looking forward to finishing
You
that one. It's pretty funny.
you fucking terror.
I was
I,
that year. 2005 was great.
um, I put the Valkyrie scene in my film under fair use. I hope it applies. I'm not telling the film it's experimental. Says leaving art school. Tell us what that is in reference to. Art school. Um, Jarlis says, when I was in Mexico, I visited where they filmed the mummies in the intro, in the original. All right, Rajeev Ram, tell us not what you wrote this week, but the most recent piece.
I haven't published anything in a while, and that's mostly because I've been busy with working two different remote roles at the moment, which have been pretty edifying and busy. I have a lot of drafts of various things. But yeah, I nothing that I recently published that's like this is what I'm talking about lately. I have random notes that I'm talking about. I think at some point, if I get to it, like a lot of stuff that's coalescing in my mind because one of my roles is working at this AI company is stuff around like AI. But I don't know if that's gonna get into something that's publishable.
Interesting.
So
Yeah, I keep meaning to talk to you about AI and keep forgetting to because the whole subject is so fascinating. So last week's article, see what yeah, so previous week I wrote an article that's doing very well called We Hate Testosterone, and it's kind of blowing the fuck up right now, and people are loving it and hating it. I'm getting some hate, which is fine. Um
That's what means you made it
that's
with the article, right?
that's what we like. But also I'm not above criticism, and there have been some interesting criticisms of it. But then this week I wrote a follow-up piece called Do We Hate Testosterone? And it was for paid subscribers. And basically the answer that I still come to is yes, but it depends. It depends on context. I give two examples, and I think first of all, just I was like, well, just to be completely honest, I think I hate it because I think that I grew up with some of the worst excesses of masculine behavior, and there's always the terror of becoming that and knowing that I could. And that's not that does not feel good. And so there's kind of a deeper story that I didn't acknowledge in my we hate testosterone piece, which is actually we do, but more than anything else, I do. And under
hmm.
circumstances, I struggle with it because I grew up seeing the worst of it. And I feel that energy come out and it scares me. It's not fun. And um but it's something that I have to accept. I have to work with it. And I know that. And that's what I'm doing, right? But then I do think that we hate it. And I give two examples. I think that um, one example is just the way Matthew, I forget which chapter, I think it's Matthew 5, where Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount says, if you lust after a woman, you have committed adultery with her in your own heart, and you must cut out your eye. Or it is better, he doesn't mean it literally, but it is better to cut out your own eye than for that eye to cause you to sin. And so what we see is a very direct conflation of thought and fantasy with behavior. Okay, now the problem with this is that any trans man who goes on testosterone will tell you that, yeah, Ishmael says that verse is so fucking eating crushed me, man. Right. Because guess what? To any trans man who goes on exogenous testosterone will tell you their eye becomes pornographic. That is a
Mm.
function
Mm-hmm.
of a neutral force in the body called testosterone. That is how our brains respond to testosterone on average, not in every case, but on average. And so I 100% believe that we do villainize all of those energies outside of the charmed circle. And one of them is lust. One of them is fantasizing about other people. And people are having sexual thoughts all the time. Some, sit in class, the person sitting next to you having sexual thoughts, maybe about you, maybe about the person sitting, maybe about the teacher, maybe about the professor, who knows. But that's just our condition. And it's fine. It's okay. And instead of telling men that this is a neutral force, this that it is actions that harness we can harness that energy, and we can channel it into martial arts, into creativity, into the book My Name is Asher Lev by Chaim Potok. He has this fantastic talk about it's about artists in Brooklyn, and it's Jewish artists, and there's a whole section in it about channeling the erotic energy while painting a nude, while painting, and so instead of saying, look, this is a neutral force, this is fine, and this lust that arises for other people, you see someone beautiful, and then suddenly you're flooded with with pornography just playing on the wall of your mind. Instead of us saying, how dare you, which is how this is so often taught in Christian circles. And we are a Christian civilization. We live in Christian waters. And so we have all received that. Instead of saying, how dare you, we could just say, this is actually a sign of health. You're good job, high tea, awesome. You're a healthy young. Let, Now let's channel that. It's neutral. That's what do you do with it that matters. You can channel it into something productive, or you can channel it into the worst impulses and abuse someone else. The choice is yours.
And I would
But
even
yeah,
add to, you're talking about the charm circle of intimacy. There's like a charm circle of what's considered productive, too,
yes.
right? Right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like, well, you can do these things. Like, you can try to work like a high power, like corporate job, or you can try to you know, um, be very competitive in sports. But it's like, can you channel that into writing like erotic short stories? Like, is that acceptable?
Mhm.
Can you channel it into making art? Can you channel it into like deeply challenging activities and practices around pleasure?
Yes.
So there's even a charmed circle about what's considered acceptable for
Productive.
productivity. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I've seen a lot of talk lately, and even today, someone, I wish I remembered who wrote this. It might have just been somebody that I don't even know, but they were talking about how sexual repression is responsible for so many great literature works. And we've seen it a lot lately too, where they say that the sexual energy can be channeled into things like great architecture, just world building in general. And the literature part I appreciated, and like it was something like all great art and great literature comes from a place of like a deep sexual, not necessarily repression in the way that we were talking about, is not how I read it. uh Not denying oneself, but just being denied, maybe, or just something unrequited, or just the feeling in general.
And here's the thing. I've been thinking about writing an article about this forever because I saw there was some Substack article. I would have to go way, 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 way back in my notes to find it because I restacked it with some commentary. But it was like some gorgeous, I forget which model or athlete this was, but she's absolutely fucking beautiful. Like 11 out of 10 gorgeous. And she was like not in a training season or whatever, and there were pictures of her in unflattering light in a suit to a pool, and all of these dudes on Twitter and so on X were saying she's mid actually, and we've been here's the thing is it's always a fake. It's always fake. The pinnacle of beauty is always fake, is basically what they were saying. And there was some like MGTOW stuff thrown in there, and there was like it's always a con. Like and these are guys who are like, gooning to like the most prosthetic type of female beauty imaginable, and so they already have very unreasonable expectations. Um but here's the thing, and this was my thought in response to it, is sexual pleasure is always unsatisfying. Always. And that's good. That's actually good. And when we can embrace that, now you can play. Now you're ready to go. Because when we realize like, and it's the same with a meal. Oscar Wilde has this wonderful quote. I think Oscar Wilde is right about a lot of things. And he has this quote in Dorian Gray where Lord Henry is just smoking cigarette after cigarette after cigarette after cigarette. And Lord Henry says, it's the perfect pleasure. It almost satisfies you, but it leaves you wanting more. And in a way, that's all pleasure. And if we consciously realize that, like, I could go to an incredible restaurant and have an amazing meal. Will it satisfy me? No, of course not. And when we accept that, then it becomes okay. Then it becomes fine, and we can play with that, and we can explore that. And so it's like, yes. Anyway, yeah.
I'll give you an example of something that I think there's a lot of people, like, if you have this very restrictive definition of what's like productive when it comes to deploying sexual energy in particular. So like at this company that I work for right now, a lot of it is around developing AI characters, mostly for specific companies and platforms for specific things, whether it's like marketing a particular blockchain or like explaining a particular type of technology or product in a compelling way. And the guy that I'm working for, I'll try not to break NDA too much. But one of the potential things that he talked about was like, it would be interesting to know if we could develop like an AI character that was kind of like an interactive Playboy magazine, because Playboy magazine obviously famously had pictures of women, but it also had like articles and interviews with people, right? And there's the joke of like reading the Playboy for the articles, but that's an actual like production publication fact, is like
Yeah.
it was this
Journal,
combination
right?
of
They did some
uh,
they had like great book reviews. I'm being dead serious.
yeah, right. And so the idea, like, this is one of the kind of like kilter staff conversations we were having, but he was like, it would be really cool if like as human beings we could deploy creative energy into creating a sort of software architecture, that's basically a fancy LLM wrapper that's an interactive Playboy so that it has like tasteful eroticism and sort of like a tasteful capturing of like women, but also has informational things that it can give you. And like that's an example of something like if you put that into like an HR company, we're a pretty small company, so we don't have an HR company yet. But if you put that through the HR filter, they'd be like, no, that's bad. Testosterone is bad. You're trying to objectify women, blah, blah, blah. And obviously for me, like, it doesn't have like capturing beautiful women isn't exactly something that has a direct appeal. But for me, I was like, that's really interesting. That's a very creative way to deploy sexual energy in a way that, even makes you a little bit of money that you can deploy into more production and that sort of thing. And this does not fall in the charmed circle of productivity that a lot of people see for testosterone in modern society by any means.
Hold on, we're using the phrase "charmed circle" so much. I'm gonna have to go back and find the use the phrase "charmed circle" because it's so great. But no, I mean stuff that's so fascinating. And basically, instead of seeing these energies as innately bad, instead we just see them as energy, and they can be put towards positive or negative usages, right? And so lust, aggression, violence, a violent instinct, um, protectiveness, all of
I was just thinking of a pickup line that someone accused, like, "Hey, babe, can I take a picture of you to put in our AI character image database so we can use it for our Playboy type thing?" But
that.
you know what I mean? Like, to me, like, there's a certain amount of like playfulness and innocence, right? Figuring out how to create art in that way. And I'm sure there'd be like some woman who like is very confident in her own sensuality who would like pose for a picture and want to be part of like a Playboy LLM. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. What That's amazing. I was reached out to by Playboy magazine several several months ago to be interviewed for their print edition. I won't say any more than that, but yeah, no, I was reached out to by Playboy magazine. This is all because of my previous life as a Satanist. Journalists are still reaching out to me. Um, but okay, you're talking about
Well, I think we're
yes,
just
go on.
talking about the neutrality, like the very restrictive circle of what is considered acceptable and productive deployment of basically aggressive, creative testosterone energy. And I think Ishmael said we need a way that motivates men without guilt. And I think that's why, like, Steven, you talk more about this explicitly, but for me, it's very implicit, which is again drawing back all the way. We're talking about like the intensity of tantric practices, like playfulness and pleasure are an integral part of vitality and eroticism, especially
Play
for men, and yeah, that's, I don't know, whatever we're doing in the West is not cultivating the context for that. So
100%.
um,
And okay, so just gonna pause to read some comments. Also, hello everyone. If you are joining us, um, you jumped into the weird part of Substack. I'm sorry. What the fuck are you doing here? Um, okay. RM says, I'm taking bioidentical hormones as I've been in my late 40s and nearing 50, and mostly benefiting from progesterone for mood, but small amounts of testosterone for me as a woman is helping with all the yang leadership roles I need to do, as well as protecting my hemoglobin from being so slow. And I'm noticing that the men in my life, as I'm getting older, I'm getting annoyed are getting annoyed if they I'm getting annoyed if they seem too mild, and I have to be in my masculine all the time with them. And then Justin says, I don't think my cat is yelling at me. Okay, you want to. Um, Justin says, I don't think I really want excessive libido and intermittent explosive disorder back. So the conversation with my endocrinologist will be tough because I already have lower T and excess estrogen. Um, and then Jarlis says, I prefer the high openness brand from Big Five over weird. And then RM says, I think the physical hormones themselves are one aspect to be balanced, but it is so affected by by life experience. That's right. So yeah, so much there. I mean, there's so there's a lot of controversy about the degree to which hormones actually shape us. What I don't think there is any question about is that they do to some degree, to a degree, because if we have a lifetime of exposure to a particular hormone, that's going to shape us. But the way that interacts, but I mean, different people's individual structures are different. They will respond differently. And
I would say too that, I mean, just speaking, because it's been a while since I've tried to talk about these things, but from like an endocrine neuroscience perspective, like metabolism is always upstream from hormones, right? Metabolism basically governs a lot of which hormones get synthesized and deployed in your bloodstream for various different things too. So hormones is like a little bit above on that stack of things, right? So when you're in messing around with hormones, right, it's like messing with a little bit more superficial layer than messing with the metabolism directly often.
totally, yeah, I mean, and I was just today reading an article that asserted, how do I say that? How do I want to say this? That basically the role that testosterone plays, that I don't think anyone disagrees with, is that it shapes the development of genitalia and primary and secondary sex characteristics, right? But beyond that, there's a lot of controversy among people. And just today, I was reading a Substack writer who is very strongly arguing that basically after that, it's all culture. It is all and culture, and there seems to be this fear that if we say, for example, rough and tumble play, what we see cross culturally in children, but also throughout mammals, is that um, kids who are bathed in a higher degree of testosterone in utero engage more in rough and tumble play with each other, and that is a sort of aggression, right? And
I'll
so
even say it goes beyond rough and tumble play because I'll give you a really funny example, which is really cute. But I have this farm that I go to. It's about an hour away. It's this family farm. It's where I get like my beef fat and my ground beef and other things from, just because it's like the only source that I trust. But they have these like these plenty of cute kids, but they have like this older son and daughter that are like usually in the store. And so when I went there a couple weeks ago, to get my stuff, like the older daughter and the son were eating their lunch, right? And like they're like the son is like 3 and like the daughter is like 1.5. I don't know, something like that, right? And like you could see like just very very young, right? And so like they had this plate of lunch and you could see like the daughter was like daintily like arranging her peas on one side and the other side, and then like you trying to like grasp the spoon to eat it, and then the boy was just like ripping into his steak. He was just like using his fingers to like
yeah,
he just like was deriving a ton of enjoyment out of like ripping the flesh off and stuffing it into his mouth, and he didn't give a fuck about the organization of his plate. Like it was just time to go to town with his bit of food. So you
yeah,
know
totally.
that's
And
yeah.
yeah, I mean the differences in childhood between T exposure in utero are huge, and the effects on psychology in my opinion, are huge. But to me, that doesn't that makes culture more important. And it sounds so often when people say there is no there we're completely a blank slate, and there's nothing predisposed in us. That to me seems to suggest that violence and darkness and ugliness is destiny because it's baked into biology. And in fact, to me, it's the opposite. It's like, no, we have to know our bodies. The most incredible, actually, let me back up. The most incredible reaction that I've gotten so far from people have been from men. I got a message from a young man who's he's a Christian, and he he reached out to me and he said that he has always felt deeply ashamed of himself for his sexuality and
Mm,
for how much quote struggles with lust, right? And he's
mm,
reading your article helped me realize that there's nothing wrong with me. And then on the other end, there was one another man told me, I have struggled my entire life with anger, and I always thought it was my fault. And I always thought if I could that I could just think my way out of it, and I haven't been able to, and it is driven to suicidal despair. Article to understand that I'm normal. And it's like if we
I
know
mean, if you
what
want to talk
it,
about culture, it's almost like the opposite problem where we have such a culture that has completely basically snuffed out violence and aggression, and mostly for good measure,
yeah,
right? I mean, I don't think like anybody reasonable wants like huge mass scale violence, but like, I remember it's so funny. Like, there's all these like Marvel movies and other things where like Black Widow, it shows her like taking down a bunch of like, 200 pound, 250 pound men with like her super, crazy, Black Widow skills. And like, I remember like going to like jujitsu, or like I've been going to it for a long time, and like, the girls there, like they're very skilled, like they've been training for a long time. But even for someone like me who's been training for like a year and some in my life, I can still take them down
yeah,
super easily. And like we've almost forgotten as a culture, like the level of like testosterone encourages a lot of muscle development, and just the level of strength and aggression that default exists in men. It's because of culture that has like suppressed a lot of that or tried to redirect it elsewhere, that I think a lot of people have forgotten how much of it exists by default.
Yeah.
well, I
You
mean,
know,
yes, go on, Lirpa.
I have an anecdote about that. Like I was really obsessed in high school with becoming a wrestler. I really wanted to be a wrestler. And I I weighed probably 120 pounds or something. And so looking around, I thought there's no way that I could actually beat any of the people within my weight class to even have the tiniest of a chance. I would have had to go down to like 103, I think was the weight, and that would have been unhealthy. But there was a girl on the wrestling team, just one, and she, was a champ for keeping it up. Like the only matches she ever won were when the guy would forfeit because he didn't want to wrestle a girl. But she kept at it. And I mean, it was just so very obvious, and I was weight training at the time too. I ended up becoming a wrestling cheerleader, of course, instead. But I was weight training at the same time with these guys. I was obsessed with becoming as strong as I could because I really wanted to be a wrestler. And I was taking creatine. I was supplementing with it. I grew a lot. I had to go up a pant size because my legs got so big. But at that time, I mean, I still couldn't have beaten anybody. And I did like grapple with a couple of them, who would humor me. And yeah, I mean, I was pinned instantly. Like, I mean, there was no doubt about it. It didn't matter how strong I got, and that's something you're right. The culture has like tried to tell us that it does not matter when, it was very clear to me very early on when I tried to compete directly with boys of my own weight, that it wasn't going to happen. It didn't matter how much creatine I took, how much time I spent in the weight room, it wasn't going to happen.
But I mean, even that is like a neutral fact, right? The fact that like
Mm-hmm.
men on average tend to be much stronger, like that's not something to make men or women feel guilty about. It's
Right.
just kind of a neutral circumstance, right?
And for me, honestly, it's a freeing sort of piece of information to me, because it tells me, I spent a lot of time in my younger years really thinking I had to compete so hard with men, and feeling like I don't have to because I simply cannot in certain areas is actually a very freeing feeling. I don't mind that. I'm happy about it, like happy in the sense that I don't have to worry about it anymore. It's freed me of that completely useless feeling of competition.
Well, when we know that something is physical, it changes our reaction to it. It
Yeah.
changes the solution. And so if we think that the best trained men are on equal footing with the best trained women, if we actually think that, that's just going to cause an enormous amount of guilt, pain,
Hmm.
suffering. And the same is true with the effects of testosterone, where it's like, if we know the bio and cultural roots of, and culture is very, someone earlier in the chat said, it's obviously both nature and nurture. Of course yes, absolutely. And if we
Hmm.
understand the nature component of it, that changes the solution to it. Suddenly the
I
solution.
mean, even in simple examples of like, high levels of testosterone greatly increase appetite. Testosterone tends to be an immune suppressant. That's why like men tend to have more difficulty with sickness or chronic sickness.
Yep.
10 tends to increase pain tolerance. So that's why men can like take a bunch of hits,
Yep.
and recover faster.
Yep.
Leaving art school, so distance running women might have an edge. And that's actually funny that you mentioned that, because I was a competitive swimmer for many years. I think the only events when like women could actually get close to me because they trained really hard, it was like long distance butterfly or like really long distance freestyle. But like everything else, I mean, it was just very clear that the men would dominate. And so yeah, I mean, testosterone very clearly has certain effects, like on the immune system, on metabolism, on other sorts of things, on muscle gain, on recovery times and things like that. And I think it's like you're saying, Lirpa, it's empowering to know that, right? Because then you
Hmm.
don't have to like compete against something that's false.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Completely unattainable.
It's honestly the thing that I keep coming back to is, I remember when I was trying very hard to not be gay, right? And there was this moment of revelation for me, because I went through the gay conversion therapy world. Um, I went through the gay conversion therapy world where we tried very hard to not be gay. Obviously, did not work, but the liberation I felt, even as someone who still believed that it was wrong to act out my homosexuality, because I was a very conservative young guy, religiously conservative, reading about patterns in the brain and the differences between gay men and straight men, and how it's so deep. They are finding differences in phalange structure on the hands between gay men and straight men. They are finding differences to all of these physiological differences. They're very minute, but it's just like it's so deep. And the weight that that lifted off of me, because it was like, thank God, this isn't my fault. And there's something really liberating about that, to realize like, this is the way I am and it's okay. It like, I will, because of my sex, as a, if say I were a woman, because of my sex, I will be on average less effective or less strong in certain areas, and that's okay. And then the same holds true
Mhm.
for men in some areas. And it should be liberating. I remember watching a video by Serena Williams, or as an interview with Serena Williams, like the brilliant tennis player, and she was asked, I don't know if it was like Jon Stewart or someone asked her, it was a late night talk show, asked her, would you ever compete with the top men's champion? And she was like, fuck no. She said he would beat me in less than a minute. She said he would destroy me. It's a different game. The men hit harder, they hit faster. It's just a different game. And she's like, I want to compete with women. It's a that men's tennis is a different game. And I think that that's just a healthy way to look at
Yeah.
it. And
Yeah, a different game,
to
totally.
be clear, this doesn't mean that there aren't lots of women who couldn't beat the shit out of me. And it means that there are a lot of men who are less strong on average than many women. It's a bell curve. It's overlapping here.
Yeah, I mean, this like there's a lot more variance within males too. Like this is the other thing, right? So like towards the center, you might have things that are equivalent in terms of strength or stuff like that, but it's oftentimes towards the tails that, because men have a higher variance, like the strongest man is often going to be a lot stronger than the strongest woman, but the
Absolutely.
strongest woman might still be stronger than a lot of
Than
men.
98% of all men. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the thing that I keep wondering about is if we struggle with our bodies in this way because we're actually in a really disembodied culture. And there are some jobs, like today, a friend of mine invited me to his, um, a friend of mine invited me to this homestead, vast amount of property that he manages. And he was just like traversing massive amount of land. I was just hanging out with him, and it was like, this is a very physical job, like having to chop wood and so it's like when you it's so and that's what he does like all day long is he works outdoors. And whereas I'm more of like an indoor outdoor gay. And but if you have work that requires you to be extremely physical, or you're an athlete, then so much of this is just so obvious. It's so fucking obvious. And it only seems to be less obvious when we don't use our body. It only seems to be less obvious when we're sitting in front of computers all day. And so I kind of and so we like see each other, we see ourselves on Zoom, we have our avatars where we can kind of create a we have our Minecraft character, or kids have their Roblox characters where they can just kind of create any kind of being that they want. And there isn't much with the body, with their body. And I wonder if that disembodiment is one reason why we struggle so much with this stuff.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I
Uh,
want to read real quick. Leaving art school, theories are women may have a higher pain tolerance due to childbirth tolerance. And then Caleb responds, do you know if that took all women under consideration in the study or just the ones who have given birth? I think that's interesting because I wonder what role hormones actually have to play in the giving birth part, because there's been talk about how, the flood of, I think, is it oxytocin or is it something
Oxytocin,
else?
that's
Like,
correct. Yeah.
yeah, and it almost makes you forget. And I haven't given birth, so I mean, I'm curious about that too. But
me,
the, um, like the that flood of hormones, it almost makes you forget the pain that you experience, so that you'll want to keep doing it. I wonder how much that has an effect on it, and if it's
Mm.
hmm,
possibly not a pain tolerance thing, but a memory
Again,
and hormone
another
thing.
hormonal thing. Yeah.
Hmm.
Um, well, I want to say we should probably wrap this up soon because I gotta get going.
yeah, I've been
But
going for hours.
this has been a lovely to I'm so glad you guys are talking about this and simultaneously irritated that such honest and compassionate dialogue is so rare. Obviously, what he's saying is I should drink more vodka. That's the implication, right?
I'm gonna drink more of my THC drink too.
Really, I am always the only sober person on stream. It is I'm
It's
always the
true.
Southern Baptist teetotaler every single time. All
When
right.
I'm back in Virginia, I drink tea, but I'm in Minnesota, so I have to drink weed, you know. It's a novelty.
Of course. All right. Well, everyone, thank you so much for tuning in. This has been
Yeah,
so
this is
fun.
great.
This is great. Just a heads up, quick announcement. We will be having to change the time of the stream at some in the coming weeks because my work schedule is going to change. I will be working later, about an hour later on Sunday, which means this stream will have to start an hour or two later than it is. We'll probably try to keep it on Sunday because Sunday seems to be a good time for people, but that's just a heads up. So just keep an eye out for a potential hour difference time change.
Yeah,
Um,
we'll make an announcement.
any final words, thoughts, snide remarks before we wrap up?
Just one reminder
Yeah.
for our upcoming bad dating advice with Prester John Andrews. Please submit any dating related questions to
Yeah.
myself, Stephen, or Prester John. You can use the DM function, however you'd like to. Yes. So please submit your questions, and we'll have an upcoming podcast or stream where we answer them.
Yes, and we will ruin your life. We are going.
Yes.
We are. It's called bad dating advice for a reason. So you give us your most heartfelt, desperate question, and then we give you the worst answers that will inevitably result with you in prison and in enormous amounts of debt, and who knows what
Like
else.
the ideal number, like how many dates you should have before you tell a woman she's fat, right? Like that, right?
Well, the basic
Like
premise is
between the third and the fourth date, probably, right, is when you should go for and just be like, man, you're really chunky.
that well, the basic premise is that we like all three of us are in long-term marriages,
We
and
have been off the market for quite some time.
we've been
Caught the last chopper out of Nam sort of vibe,
and we know nothing about dating. So we're like the worst people to ask about dating.
Mhm.
But we will try to give advice based on our experience like a decade ago.
Yeah.
Nice.
All right, everyone. This was great. Thank you so much. And we will see you around the Substacks, and we'll see you next week. Bye bye.
Mhm.
Sound
Bye.
good. See you.